have with me Ambassador Stuart Holliday. Well, he's the CEO of Meridian International Center, which is, of course, a leading nonpartisan institution advancing global security and space diplomacy. So it's so lovely to speak to you.
Well, it's an honor to be with you, and thank you for coming and your partnership today.
Well, I'd also like to know, with a conference like this, what are you trying to achieve?
So Meridian has a unique purpose, which is we don't have an agenda, a single agenda. We're used to sort of bring together disparate views, different sectors, and space is a perfect example where traditionally the government has talked to each other and the private sector has, newly arrived, but they have had different perspectives, different needs, and then you have the diplomatic community in Washington, which is so important. And with the Artemis Accords and the need for more space diplomacy, it's a natural that we're used for this purpose because it's a useful platform.
So let's look at this whole thing of safeguarding space as a shared resource, because that's becoming an issue as more entrants come into this market. So how do we ensure the safeguarding of space while still promoting the innovation and development that we're looking for?
Well, let me unpack that. That's a big question. There's the space debris side of things and the risk with all of the 5,000 satellites and the millions of pieces of micro debris floating around. There's also the militarization of space. Somewhat controversially, the United States put out, a space part of its national security strategy. China, of course, is marching forward on its own with some of its own priorities. And so we're at a sort of a dangerous inflection point right now. And I say it's also a time of opportunity because it is when there is a convergence of need and potentially space will either be another domain of competition and confrontation, but more likely there will need to be some sort of accommodation, and we'll need to think about how to do that.
Well, it's described sometimes as the Wild West because there's a lack of worldwide laws, there's uncertainty, how are we going to do space exploration, and people are worried it might lead to the escalation of conflicts into space. So what can be done about it? How important is space diplomacy?
Well, I think if you look at other similar issues, like the oceans, for example, there's the Convention on the Law of the Sea, which has been in force and generally accepted for decades. However, the United States did not ratify that treaty. You have conversations between the Artemis Initiative and the Chinese Lunar Initiative, but they're not willing to share all the information and be completely transparent. So it's just like any other form of diplomacy, which you need to have cooperation start with something tangible, like the International Space Station, which led to, even still today, cooperation between Russia and the United States. So I think it's tangibility. It's also being open and inclusive, and that's why I think the Artemis Accords have been so successful, is they've looked at not just a country's capacity to actually have a space program, but their needs potentially to benefit from research and science, as well as potentially having astronauts from their countries go into orbit.
But do you need buy-in from Russia and China in the Artemis Accord?
I think the answer is that if China is willing to abide, by the terms and the principles of the Artemis Accord, there should be no reason, why they do not. They so far have been unwilling to do that. And of course, Russia right now needs China for the terrestrial conflicts it's facing, economic support to avoid sanctions, military equipment for Ukraine. And so there's a marriage of convenience here because Russia's had a space program going back to Sputnik, right? And the Chinese now have resources, ambition, and so I think they see a way to parlay Russian technological and science capability with Chinese resources. And this has also got to be sorted out anyway, even if we didn't have the potential militarization of space. There's a real need in the world now to chart a course that includes a pathway for the rule of law and for, respect for human rights. And we have some people in the traditional post-war world order, U.S.-led camp. Then you have some people now gravitating towards this China camp on the basis of hedging their bets. Now, fortunately for them, the Artemis Accords is sort of a non-binding thing, but there are many more countries that have signed on because I think they like the values that are represented there.
So we need international treaties and regulations, to rein this all in. So what should it look like?
Well, if you recall, the architecture that we currently live under goes back to 1967, and the world is very different. That's when the United Nations came together, following about a decade of the space race, to try to codify the fact that the space belongs to all countries, that there's no claims of sovereignty in space, that space shouldn't be a militarized, and over the years, there have been attempts by the UN, and there is one ongoing called Space 2030, where they're trying to, in effect, update the original intent by the United Nations to accommodate, the private sector, new actors, new players, and so that's important. You also have these ad hoc, agreements bilaterally. And I think it also goes back to building enough support for principles everybody can agree on first. It was very sad, to see Russia veto the resolution last week on nuclear weapons in space, but they, on the other hand, are saying, well, you have weapons in space that are part of your nuclear arsenal. They may not be nuclear weapons in space, but they're clearly a threat. So you want your cake and eat it too. And I think we're at a point where the United States needs to invest in its diplomacy. Some of the skills and capabilities of our diplomats, which were more traditional, political and economic. Now there's AI, there's climate, there's space, the Arctic, quantum computing. When you think about, being trained as a diplomat, those aren't the things that come to mind. And so that's why it's important for our State Department to engage other actors, industry, experts, academia, to create a larger ecosystem to be able to advance cooperation.
So what we're trying to establish is, how do we address sort of this shared challenge that everybody has through diplomatic means?
It's not necessarily just that this is a new issue. It's what can we learn from the past about when we've had breakthroughs and why those have been, and how we can use those to try to lower the temperature in the world and try to bring in, hopefully, more nations that don't want to see a conflict between these great powers.
I just wanted to ask, can the emerging spacefaring nations play a role?
They have policy power, so they can play a significant role. And they also are economic players in many cases. Some have already moved into space, like the UAE. I think there's something like 200 countries that, 180 countries that have had something to do with space as part of their national security or economic life. But that may be tangential. It may be basing a relay station. The whole world plays a critical role in supporting space exploration.
Well, from what you've observed today, is there anything you'd like to add of what you've seen, some breakthrough, some path, something that you could take away from it?
Well, I think looking at the cooperation between, this is inside governmental baseball, but the fact that NASA and the State Department are cooperating so effectively on the Artemis program is quite impressive. The second thing is the expansion to 39 countries from 8 of the accords themselves. If that trend line continues, Artemis could be the basis for a new international space order, We'd have to figure out how to bring, the Russians and the Chinese to the table, what that looks like, what the situation on the ground looks like to allow that to happen. And then support the UN's efforts. Their 2030 program, it has very, I think, universally laudable goals to it. But if you read I always said when I was at the United Nations, if you read the UN Charter, it's a beautiful document. I've read every word of it. It applies today, and it was in the wake of the Second World War. The problem is not the charters, it's how do we carry forward the work of multilateral diplomacy, and that frequently gets bogged down into the veto, national sovereignty issues, and we just have to keep at it until there's a new United Nations of some type, and I don't think you could create it today. So I think we need to preserve the one we have, but broaden it out to include the private sector. The private sector in the U.S. and in other countries is kind of a stabilizing force. They endure throughout, political cycles. Of course, around the world today, you don't see as many political changes in certain countries as you used to, but they're very important because economic stability is vital. And I think having the companies here today demonstrate that at least our approach, which can be expanded to the whole world, is that the private sector has a vital role to play, not just in space exploration and transportation, but in diplomacy as well.
Well, one aspect where the private sector is involved in is space debris. That's a growing concern. So what steps can be taken to solve this issue and also to ensure compliance by private companies?
It's a big issue, one that is hard to solve because the theory is that if you put something in space, that within 25 years you have to have a plan to retrieve it. That is actually the doctrine that the UN, the United States has. Again, gap between doctrine and reality is that there are things that can be done both in terms of some sort of regulatory framework that would allow and provide for the construction of these spacecraft and satellites to be required to have some sort of technologies that either mitigate, break up, return to the Earth, dissipate, go out into the orbit. I think we're not there yet in terms of understanding what that looks like, but it's something that's as we have over 5,000 satellites in the orbit today. I don't know if you've ever seen these maps that show the satellites, but then they show all the debris surrounding the Earth, and it's not good.
Mm. Well, just lastly, we're talking about diplomacy and ways of solving these issues and getting nations to talk to each other. Normally, you would know as an ambassador, there's always a channel that you can work through. Should these channels be explored more to get countries to talk to each other?
Yes. I mean, unfortunately, too often diplomacy is practiced, no offense to you, but through the media. And sometimes the most effective diplomacy takes place behind the scenes when there's not this whole political and face-saving that needs to happen. So, if you look at the original breakthrough with China, with Henry Kissinger and meeting the Chinese in Paris, no one knew about that. And it was done, there was a risk that had to be taken by both sides. The other thing is having good communications networks, which is why it's so concerning that, we've always had that with Russia, even though they didn't accept the premise of it, before the terrorist attack on the theater in Moscow, we called them and said, here is the information we're getting about what could happen. The worrisome thing is with China, there has been a curtailment of back-channel communication. I'd like to think that it's rebuilding again. I know that Secretary Blinken was just there. Apparently things are, there's good communication now between their finance ministry and our treasury. And look, as the father of two military officers, I would say this: nobody wants war. We need to do everything we can to avoid it. And the military, General Mattis, former Secretary of Defense, said that if we don't have good diplomacy, we're going to have to make more bullets. And so it's time to really invest in diplomacy and view it as not some cocktail party chatter thing, but to do the hard work of diplomacy. Another mentor of mine, George Shultz, said that diplomacy is like a garden. You have to tend to it every day. And I think we go from summit to summit and from event to event, but we really need to kind of extend the communication channels down and have more regular channels of communication between countries for peace and stability.
Ambassador Holliday, that was
Thank
so
you.
interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it.